Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the course National and International Affairs. Today I am going to discuss with you a topic, democracy in the Middle East and also an Arab Spring. There is a question in the minds of people or in my mind that why does the Middle East lag behind the global trend of democratizations? So this has been the central question that scholars and policy analysts working on the Middle East have had to tackle for decades. The so-called third wave of democratization that began in the 1970s doubled the number of democracies in the world by the 1990s. It spread all around Latin America, East and Southeast Asia, as well as Southern, Eastern and Central Europe. However, the Middle East was left out of this trend later because authoritarianism has persisted in the region. Scholars have spilled considerable ink on the question of why the Middle East has remained stubbornly resistant to democracy. Despite the lack of satisfactory explanations, a huge body of scholarship has developed. Since 2011, the Arab world has experienced various changes. Like in 2010, the young fruit vendor, his name was Muhammad Gaddafi, he set himself on fire to protest police harassment in the town of Tunisia. As the fire of protest swept through the Middle East and North Africa, some of the authoritarian regimes in countries such as Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and Yemen were ousted. The uprising generated some forms of repressions and civil war in Syria and Bahrain. They also led to limited reforms in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE and Jordan. It is still too early to predict whether or not these transitions will lead to democratizations in the region. But it is a critical time to understand the impact of 2011 uprising on the democracies of the Middle Eastern states. So what does it mean by an Arab Spring? The Arab Spring was a loosely related group of protests that ultimately resulted in regime changes in countries such as Tunisia, Libya and Egypt. Not all of the movement, however, could be deemed successful, at least if the end goal was increased democracy and cultural freedom. In fact, for many countries enveloped by the revolts of the Arab Spring, the period since has been hallmarked by increased instability and oppression. Given the significant impact of the Arab Spring throughout the Northern Africa and the Middle East, it's easy to forget the series of large-scale political and social movements arguably began with a single act of defiance. There will be a question in your minds that why they gave the name Arab Spring. The name Arab Spring is a reference to the revolutions of 1848, also known as the People's Spring, when political upheavals swept in Europe Ever since, spring has been used to describe movements toward democracy, like Paraguay Spring. The Western media began popularizing the term Arab Spring in 2011, while the uprising in Tunisia led to some improvements in the country from a human rights perspective. Not all of the nations that witnessed such social and political upheaval in the spring of 2011 changed for the better. Most notably is in Egypt, where early changes arising from the Arab Spring gave many hope after the ouster of the President Hosni Mubarak. Authoritarian rule has apparently returned. Following the controversial election of Mohammad Morsi in 2012, a coup led by defense minister, his name was Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, he installed the latter as the president in 2013, and he remains in power today. In Libya, meanwhile, the authoritarian dictator, the Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was overthrown in October 2011 during a violent civil war, and he was tortured, literally dragged through the streets, and executed by opposition fighters. The video footages of his death was seen by millions of people online. Since Gaddafi's downfall, Libya has remained in a state of civil war, and two opposing governments effectively rule separate regions of the country. Libya's civil population has suffered significantly during the years of political upheaval, with violence in the streets and access to food, resources, and healthcare services severely limited. This has contributed in part to the ongoing worldwide refugee crisis, which has seen thousands flee from Libya, most often by boats across the Mediterranean Sea, with hopes of new opportunities in Europe. The next point is, I'm going to discuss with you the regime of Bashar al Assad. Similarly, the civil war in Syria that began in the aftermath of the Arab Spring lasted for several years, forcing many people to leave the country to seek refuge in Turkey, in Greece, and throughout Western Europe. For a time, the militant group, such as the ISIS, had declared a Khilafat, a nation governed by Islamic law, in northeastern Syria. The group executed thousands of people, and many others fled the region in the fear of their lives. Yet, although ISIS has largely been defeated in Syria, the oppressive regime of long-term dictator Bashar al Assad remains in power in the country. The ongoing civil war in Yemen can also be traced to the Arab Spring. The country's infrastructure has suffered significant damages, and the conflict has devolved into tribal warfare, and in Bahrain, peaceful pro-democracy protests in the capital, Manama, in 2011 and 2012 were violently suppressed by the government of King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa. Officially, the country has a constitutional monarchy form of government, but personal freedoms remain limited.